In all my years working red-eye flights across the United States, I learned that noise was never the thing to fear. Crying babies, drunken businessmen, rattling service carts, turbulence over the plains, all of that belonged to the job. Silence was different. Silence meant someone was watching, someone was waiting, or someone had brought something on board that did not belong in the air. And out of every face I ever served at 30,000 feet, only one woman ever made me afraid of a quiet cabin. She sat there for the entire flight with her eyes fixed on me, calm as polished glass, and she never blinked. But what stayed with me all these years was not the way she looked at me. It was the reason she had come looking for me at all. I had been flying long enough to know the difference between inconvenience and danger. Most people think flight attendants are there to smile, serve coffee, and point to the exits, but the real job happens in the spaces nobody notices. We read faces before words. We catch tension in shoulders, fear in hands, lies in the way people avoid eye contact. After enough years in the air, you learn that trouble almost never announces itself. It arrives dressed as routine. That was why the woman unsettled me so quickly. I was not young. I was not inexperienced. And I was not the kind of woman easily shaken by odd behavior at 30,000 feet. But the moment I looked at her, something in me went still. Not because I understood what was wrong, because I knew with the kind of instinct you spend a lifetime earning, that something was, it was a red eye from Chicago to Los Angeles, the kind of flight that pulls the glamour out of air travel and leaves only exhaustion behind. The cabin was half full, washed in that dim amber light airlines seem to believe is merciful at night. Coats were folded into laps, shoes slipped halfway off, window shades pulled down against a darkness, so complete it felt less like weather and more like depth. People boarded with the blank expressions of the overworked and underslept, already thinking about hotel rooms, missed calls, or whatever version of themselves would be waiting on the ground. Nothing about that night suggested it would stay with me. It looked like the kind of flight that disappears from memory before the wheels ever touch the runway, which, in my experience, is often when the worst things begin. She came in near the end of boarding, when everyone else who mattered had already found a seat and stopped looking around. No roller bag. No purse that I could see. Just a dark coat tailored too well for the hour, gloves she did not remove, and the kind of composure that can make a person seem either deeply disciplined or deeply dangerous. She was not beautiful in a way that invited attention. She was precise. Everything about her felt measured, as if she had practiced being forgettable and overshot the mark. I noticed her because she did not behave like a late passenger. No apology, no hurry, no flicker of irritation. She moved down the aisle like someone arriving exactly when she meant to. When she reached my section, I gave her the same professional smile I gave everyone boarding late and said, "Good evening." She stopped just long enough to look directly into my face, and that was when I saw it clearly for the first time. Her eyes did not flutter, did not water, did not shift to my name tag or the row numbers behind me. They held. Most people glance, then move on. She didn't. I remember thinking that maybe she had perfected some strange social habit. The way people train themselves to maintain eye contact in boardrooms and courtrooms, but there was nothing social in the way she looked at me. It felt deliberate, clinical, almost intimate, as though she had already been waiting a very long time for me to look back. And in all those seconds, she never blinked. I told myself there had to be a reasonable explanation. Dry eyes, some kind of medication. Contact lenses that made blinking uncomfortable. Fatigue can do strange things to people at night, and so can grief, fear, and whatever private battles passengers carry through an airport without anyone noticing. I had seen men cry over miniature bottles of whiskey and women hold themselves together through turbulence with the kind of dignity that makes your chest ache. So I did what experience teaches you to do. I placed her inside the category of things that are unusual but harmless. I checked her boarding pass, guided her to her seat, and moved on with the rhythm of boarding. But even then, a part of me was already watching her. From a distance, I pretended was professional. The truth was simpler than that. I was trying not to admit that she had unsettled me before she had spoken a single word. A little later, after the cabin door was closed and the safety demonstration had ended, I walked through first service with a pot of coffee in one hand and that careful smile we all learn to wear when the rest of the plane is trying to forget we exist. When I reached her row, she was sitting perfectly upright, hands folded, eyes on me, as if she had not looked anywhere else since taking her seat. I asked if she wanted anything to drink. Her voice, when it came, was low and even, the kind of voice that does not need volume to make itself felt. She said, "No, thank you, Naomi." For a second, I thought I had imagined it, that my own mind had filled in my name because her gaze was so intent. But no, she had said it clearly. "Not ma'am, not miss. Not ma'am, not miss, Naomi." And there was something in the way she said it that told me this was not the first time she had rehearsed that moment. After that, I became aware of her in the way you become aware of a sound you wish you had never noticed. Every pass down the aisle confirmed the same thing. Other passengers shifted in their sleep, rubbed their eyes, asked for water, pulled blankets higher, stared blankly into seatback screens. She did none of it. She remained still, attentive, watching me with a patience that felt almost ceremonial. It was not aggression. Aggression is easier. Aggression gives you procedure, language, witnesses. This was something worse because it stayed inside the boundaries of civility. No raised voice, no threatening gesture, no complaint. Just that fixed, unbroken gaze, as if my presence on that aircraft mattered more to her than the flight itself. By the time we reached cruising altitude, I had already begun changing direction in the galley just to avoid walking into her line of sight too often. And every time I failed, I found her already there, waiting. The first sign that her interest in me was personal came so quietly, I almost missed the danger in it. I had stopped beside her row to collect an untouched cup from the tray table when she spoke without turning her head. "Do you always look away from your passengers?" she asked. Her tone was gentle, almost conversational, but every muscle in my back tightened. I looked at her then, fully, waiting for some trace of a smile that might tell me she was joking, or confused, or mistaking me for someone else. It was nothing. Just those eyes, calm and mercilessly open. Then she added, almost in a whisper, "Or do you only run when you notice something is wrong?" And in that moment, more than the silence, or the fact that she never seemed to blink, I felt the first true pulse of fear, because that was when the memory finally began to open. I wish I could tell you that memory arrived all at once, dramatic and unmistakable, but that is not how buried guilt works. It comes apart in fragments, a tone of voice, a phrase that should mean nothing and somehow opens a locked room inside you. As I stood there beside that row, holding a plastic cup I had forgotten to move, I felt something old shift under the surface of my mind, not a clear recollection. Not yet. Just the sensation of having been brought close to a place I had spent years avoiding. There are cities you remember by smell, people you remember by the shape of their silence, and flights you remember only because some part of you never truly landed after them. I did not know what she wanted from me then, but I knew with absolute certainty that whatever tied her to me had not begun on that aircraft. It had begun years earlier, somewhere above another dark stretch of American sky. I moved into the galley and told myself to think like a professional, not like a frightened woman, with too much imagination and too little sleep. I went over the facts the way I had been trained to. She knew my name, but that alone meant nothing. Passengers read name tags all the time. She had noticed a habit of mine, but some people are unusually observant. None of that amounted to a threat. None of it justified alarm. I even considered whether I had seen her before on another route, another year, another version of myself, because the mind will always reach for the ordinary before it accepts the unbearable. Still, the more I tried to fit her into reason, the less reason held. There was no curiosity in her attention. No flirtation, no complaint, no confusion, no nervous dependence on the crew. She was not trying to get something from me in the usual ways people do. It felt more like she had come to collect something. And somewhere beneath all my training, my composure, my practiced voice and polished smile, a thought began to form that I did not want to name. She wasn't waiting for service. She was waiting for recognition. The memory finally broke open over Nebraska, somewhere between a sleeping cabin and the kind of darkness that makes every window feel like a mirror. I was pouring coffee for a man in first class when I heard her voice again behind me, low and steady, speaking as if she were continuing a conversation we had started years before. She said she was 23. The pot nearly slipped in my hand. I turned too fast, hot coffee striking the rim of the cup and spilling onto my wrist, but I barely felt it. 23. That was not a random number. That was an age I had spent too many years trying not to remember. In an instant, I was back on another flight, another red eye, another aisle under dim cabin lights, staring at a young woman seated beside a man who answered too many questions for her. I remembered the way she kept glancing toward me and then away, the way her fingers worried the edge of her sleeve, the way fear can make a face look perfectly polite from a distance. And worst of all, I remembered understanding that something was wrong. Not enough to act, I told myself then. Not enough to break protocol. Not enough to accuse a man, delay a flight, create a scene. Just enough to notice. Just enough to fail. For years, I had told myself a kinder version of that story. I told myself I had been cautious, professional, responsible. I told myself that intuition was not evidence, that fear can be misread, that a crowded aircraft is no place for private suspicions, dressed as certainty. Those were the lies that let me sleep. The truth was uglier and much smaller. I had seen enough. Not enough to prove anything to someone else. Maybe, but enough to ask one more question, enough to separate her from him for a moment, enough to look directly into her face and let her know that if she needed help, I was willing to understand what she could not say out loud. I did none of it. I chose order over instinct. I chose procedure over courage. And by the time that flight landed, the young woman was gone into the night with the man beside her, carrying a fear I had witnessed and ignored. That is the kind of failure that does not stay in the past. It simply waits for a stranger to say the right words and wake it up. When I finally approached her again, I did it because there are moments in life when dignity is only another form of delay. The cabin had gone quieter by then. A few reading lights still glowed like distant windows in a sleeping city, and the engines carried that steady low thunder that makes every private thought feel louder. I stopped beside her row and asked as evenly as I could how she knew my name. She turned her face toward me with the same composed attention she had worn all night, and for the first time I noticed how tired she looked beneath the elegance. Not physically tired. Worn in some older, harder way. She said my name again, softly, as if testing whether I could bear to hear it from her. Then she told me there are people who spend years trying to forget a flight, and people who spend those same years trying to understand it. I felt the air change in my chest. She did not raise her voice. She simply began describing that old flight with the terrible precision of someone who had studied grief until it became a language. She knew the route. She knew the season. She knew where the young woman had been sitting. And with every quiet detail, she forced me back into the version of myself I had spent years pretending I had survived with honor. I asked her who she was, and for the first time that night, something changed in her expression. Not softness, not satisfaction, something closer to old pain learning how to stand upright. She looked at me for another long second and said that the young woman on that flight had been her sister, not a friend. Not a stranger she had read about afterward. Her sister. She said the word with such control that it landed harder than if she had screamed it. Then she told me she had spent years replaying the little details no one else seemed to care about. The flight number, the arrival time, the witnesses who remembered nothing useful, the airline staff who followed procedure, the crew member who noticed her sister was afraid and did nothing that changed the outcome. I could not breathe properly after that. Because beneath her calm, beneath the elegance and the stillness and the unbearable composure, I finally understood what I had been looking at all night. I was not being haunted by mystery. I was being looked at by grief with a face. She never accused me of killing her sister. That would have been easier to survive. Instead, she accused me of something far more human and far more damning. She said her sister had spent that entire flight trying to ask for help without saying the words outright, because fear does that to some women. It seals the throat and pushes all the terror into the eyes. She said her sister had looked at me more than once, hoping I would understand what politeness was hiding. Then she leaned back slightly and, with that same impossibly steady gaze, told me the reason she had not looked away from me once that night. She said, "My sister spent hours begging with her eyes, and nobody held her gaze long enough to hear her." So I wanted to know how it feels when someone finally refuses to look away. That was the moment the meaning of her stillness became unbearable. It was not a trick, not a disorder, not theatrical cruelty. It was a lesson. A punishment built entirely from attention. And no raised voice could have cut deeper than that. I wish I could say I defended myself, that I found some brave and intelligent thing to offer in return. Some sentence that would explain the limits of training in fear and the terrible uncertainty of being responsible for strangers in the air. But shame has a way of stripping language down to almost nothing. I stood there in the dim cabin, one hand resting on the edge of her seat for balance, and felt my professional mask separate from me like something dead and useless. The worst part was that she was right. Not completely, not in every detail grief had sharpened inside her, but right where it mattered most. I had seen a young woman asking for rescue in the only safe language she had left, and I had answered her with caution. I had told myself I needed proof when what I really needed was courage. Around us, the aircraft continued exactly as before. A man snored softly 3 rows back. Someone called for water near the rear galley. The engines kept their indifferent hum. And there I was, 30,000 feet in the air, realizing that the moment which had defined the rest of her life had also quietly defined mine. I just had not been honest enough to name it. The descent began not long after that, and with it came the ordinary choreography of arrival. Seat backs up, tray tables locked, blankets folded. The familiar preparations moved through the cabin like ritual, and for everyone else on board, it must have felt like the closing of a forgettable night. For me, the approach into Los Angeles felt like a trial with no judge and no verdict, only the slow tightening of air and memory. I kept moving because that is what flight attendants do when the world inside them is breaking. We move, we smile, we check latches and answer call buttons and make our voices sound, steady enough for strangers to trust. But every time I passed her row, I could feel the question sharpening inside me. How does a person keep living after discovering that the worst thing she ever did was not an action, but an absence, not violence, not malice? Just the failure to step forward when another woman's fear was asking to be seen. By the time the wheels lowered, I no longer felt afraid of who she was. I was afraid of how clearly she had shown me who I had been. When the aircraft finally touched down, the cabin gave that small collective exhale passengers always release at the end of a night flight, as if surviving transit deserves its own private prayer. Phones lit up. Seatbelts clicked open too early. Overhead bins snapped and shifted. Life, impatient and ordinary, rushed back into everyone else at once. She remained seated, calm, upright, watching me with the same unwavering attention that had followed me from the first moment she stepped on board. I stood near the forward galley while passengers filed out around her, each one carrying bags, fatigue, half-finished thoughts, and no idea that something irreversible had just happened a few feet away. Then, when the aisle was nearly empty, she rose. No drama. No final accusation. She stepped closer and placed a folded slip of paper in my hand, her gloved fingers cool against my skin, then turned away without another word. I did not open it while she was watching. I could not. Only after she had disappeared into the jet bridge, swallowed by that dull airport light, did I let myself unfold it. It was a printed screenshot of a phone screen dated from that same night, all those years ago. The message had been sent minutes after we landed. The words staring back at me were a sentence no apology of mine could ever erase. The flight attendant noticed. I begged with my eyes and she looked back at me. The flight is over, but I am still hoping she finds a way to send help. And in that instant, standing inside a plane that had already touched down, I understood that arrival and relief are not the same thing.